Undercover CEO is treated like garbage by his own employees, instantly regrets what he hears. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. The floors were sticky, and the air smelled sharply of burnt coffee beans, mixed with something stale. But the man no one knew as Michael Reynolds took it all in without a word. His grey polyester uniform, so different from the suits he was used to, itched at the collar, but he made no move to adjust it. It was important he remain invisible for now. Just another new hire at Grind and Go Coffee, an entry-level trainee. Who would shadow the shift supervisor? He stood behind the counter, waiting, but nobody bothered with introductions. In fact, one of the baristas, a lanky teenager with tired eyes, glanced at him, shrugged, and went right back to wiping down the espresso machine. Michael cleared his throat to see if anyone would give him a quick tour, or at least a rundown of the register system, but no such luck. It dawned on him that he might have to learn things entirely on his own. His gaze flicked around the cramped store. Behind the counter, a row of coffee machines gleamed with a thin film of caked milk residue, and in the dining area, stained tables were left unwiped for who knows how long. He noticed a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, hustling between drive-through orders and the front counter, her face tight with stress. Nobody was helping her. Right away, he sensed a tension in the air, like some unspoken rule that you fended for yourself or got trampled. Michael, disguised as Mike Rogers, found it baffling that a place boasting corporate slogans about employee respect could feel so hostile the moment you stepped inside. The shift supervisor was nowhere to be seen, and it wasn't until a loud crash of dishes in the back that Michael realized he might be the only one who heard it. The teenager by the espresso machine shot him a look, then resumed his half-hearted cleaning, leaving Michael to wonder whether that crash might be someone needing help. But if no one else was going to check, maybe he should. He took a tentative step, unsure if he had the authority to walk back there, but a woman's voice snapped from the door leading to a tiny office area. "Where are you going?" she said, not bothering to hide the annoyance in her tone. Michael froze. I heard something fall," he replied quietly. "Figured I'd see if someone needs help." She stared at him, eyes narrowing as if he'd just asked permission to rob the place. "We don't got time for that," she huffed. "It's probably Eric or someone messing around. We got customers waiting." Then, without introducing herself, she pushed past him and started taking an order from a customer who had been left standing at the counter. Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. It was a strange environment. Nobody was smiling, no one was greeting customers warmly, and everyone seemed to be either too overworked or too jaded to care. Just as he was about to step forward to assist at the register, a tall man in his mid-30s barged out from the back, phone in hand. He wore the coffee shop's uniform with the name tag Eric, along with a manager's badge that identified him as a shift supervisor. Without so much as a glance at Michael, he scrolled through something on his screen, then leaned against the counter as if he owned the place. If only he knew who was standing next to him, his CEO, the founder of this entire chain, disguised in a cheap uniform. Michael forced himself to remain calm as he realized Eric wasn't going to offer any kind of training. Finally, the woman at the register barked at Eric. "He's the new hire. You want to show him what to do?" She hadn't even bothered to speak to Michael directly. Eric lifted his gaze but didn't pocket his phone. Instead, he looked Michael up and down with a smirk. "Yeah, new guy," he said, letting out a dismissive laugh. "How about you just watch for now? I'll tell you when you can do something." Eric then turned back to his phone, ignoring them both. Michael's temper flared, but he reminded himself why he was here. He wanted to see what was really happening at the ground level. He'd been receiving complaints about certain managers, about toxic leadership, employee mistreatment, unexplained firings, but he never imagined it would be this blatant. The first real shock came when he caught Eric muttering something insulting about low-level grunts under his breath, referring to the staff. That was enough to let Michael know this environment was a mess, from the top of the local hierarchy down. The question was whether it was just Eric, or a whole system that kept problematic managers in place. Right away, he picked up on the exhausted young woman again, the one who seemed to be juggling multiple tasks. Her name tag read Sarah. She busily served customers, brewed coffee, ran the register, and even tried to restock cups whenever there was a brief lull. In the background, Eric tapped away on his phone, making no effort to help. Michael observed Sarah's mounting frustration. Her hair was slipping out of her ponytail, sweat beading on her forehead from the constant rush. A frustrated customer snapped at her, complaining that the coffee tasted off. Sarah apologized profusely, offered to replace the drink, and then darted to the machine. Eric, still on his phone, didn't even look up. Michael could see in Sarah's eyes that she was about to break down, but she kept it together, biting her tongue. That was the moment he realized it wasn't just an off day or some fluke of a busy shift. There was something deeply wrong with the management style here, and even though it infuriated him, he knew he had to endure it and remain undercover a while longer if he wanted to see the full extent of this toxic environment. He swallowed his anger, promising himself that once he'd seen enough, he would set things right. But for now, he would witness it all. Every disrespectful remark, every neglected responsibility, and gather the truth for himself. Because if Eric and others like him were running the place, Grind and Go Coffee had a much bigger problem than just a few rude managers. It had a cultural crisis that started at the top of each store's local command. It didn't take long for that first red flag to explode into something impossible to ignore. Michael had hardly settled into the routine of assisting Sarah when Eric re-emerged from his back-office retreat, phone still in hand. A line of customers stretched to the door, and Sarah was scrambling to keep up, while the teenage barista was anxiously trying not to drown in cappuccino orders. Finally, Sarah, who was nearing a meltdown, pleaded for help. "Eric, can you take the register for a minute?" she asked, voice trembling from exhaustion. Eric rolled his eyes dramatically. "I'm busy," he said, gesturing to his phone, like it was some top-secret corporate business. Though Michael could clearly see he was scrolling through social media feeds, Sarah pressed her lips together, trying not to argue. Michael felt a surge of anger on her behalf. Here she was, trying to hold the entire front end together, while Eric lounged about, completely indifferent. Michael decided to step behind the register himself. "Show me how to ring up the next customer," he asked Sarah quietly, keeping his voice neutral. Sarah darted over, quickly explaining the basics: how to select drinks, customize them, and take payment. She was fast, but she had no time to offer a thorough orientation, so Michael knew he'd be learning on the fly. Still, he stepped in to ring customers up, noticing how each of them looked annoyed at the wait times. He remained calm, focusing on giving decent service. But just as he was getting the hang of it, Eric snatched the receipt tape he had just printed. "You messed this up," Eric barked. "You didn't charge extra for the syrup shot, and that comes out of the store's pocket." Michael was taken aback. The customer was still standing there, looking embarrassed. Sarah tried to explain that she had forgotten to mention that detail to Michael, but Eric cut her off. "So you're making the new hire's mistakes for him now?" Eric sneered, then shot Michael a condescending grin. "I guess I'll have to start deducting from your paycheck if you can't figure out how to tap a button." The customer stepped away, clearly uncomfortable, and Sarah apologized to them again. Michael forced a tight smile. "I'll correct it," he said, staying composed. Inside, though, he was fuming. This was a classic example of a minor error being blown out of proportion, used to bully an employee, exactly the kind of toxic environment he'd been warned about. Still, it got worse. Later in the shift, as Michael tried to help brew a fresh pot of coffee, he noticed that the machine's filter was near broken, creating a potential hazard if the grounds spilled over. "Hey, we need a new filter," he pointed out to Eric. "We could have a mess in here, or worse, burn someone if it overflows." Eric's response was a dismissive shrug. "We'll handle it later. You got orders to fill first." Michael hesitated, looking at Sarah, who mouthed a silent, "I'm sorry," as she hurried by. She'd probably raised these safety concerns before, only to be brushed aside. This was more than just rudeness. It was an outright disregard for safety and well-being, both for employees and customers. For a moment, Michael considered stepping away and making a phone call to corporate right then and there, but he needed more evidence, more clarity about how deep this rot went. Only then could he address it thoroughly and fairly. And so he bit his tongue, resolving to keep playing the part of the meek new hire. He also began to watch how Eric interacted with other employees. Aside from Sarah, there was a cashier named Laura who seemed perpetually anxious. She second-guessed every transaction, possibly because she'd been scolded one too many times. Then there was a young man named Justin who occasionally vanished outside for smoke breaks that Eric apparently approved with a quick nod. This was puzzling to Michael. Why did Justin get breaks so easily when Sarah had to practically beg to catch her breath? The discrepancy was jarring. At one point, Sarah's phone rang, and she anxiously silenced it. It rang again, and she looked torn. Eric spotted this. "You better not be taking personal calls on the clock," he snarled. Sarah tried to explain, her voice trembling, that she had to check on her child. "My babysitter had an emergency," she said softly, near tears. Eric showed no sympathy. "Then maybe you should have planned better." The call went unanswered, and Sarah was forced to keep working, wiping a tear that threatened to roll down her cheek. Michael felt a stab of pity and rage swirl together in his gut. This was definitely the red flag he'd been warned about. Employees forced to neglect personal emergencies out of fear, and managers like Eric flaunting their power at every turn. By the time the lunch rush ended, Sarah was drenched in sweat, and Laura looked close to fainting. Eric, on the other hand, was as fresh as ever, phone in hand, chortling at memes or texting whomever he deemed important enough to receive his attention. He wandered back into the office, leaving the staff to clean up the aftermath of the rush. One by one, customers left the store, some frustrated by the chaotic service, others simply oblivious as they carried away their iced lattes and sandwiches. Michael found himself mentally cataloguing each instance of Eric's negligence. It wasn't just the laziness, it was the contempt, the utter lack of respect, and he wondered how many employees had to endure this silently, feeling powerless because management support was non-existent. He recalled the rumor that Eric was tight with the regional manager. Could that be why nobody dared report him? Possibly, but Michael silently vowed that would change soon. Once he gathered enough evidence, he would see to it that Eric's reign ended. For now, though, he needed to watch as the small injustices continued piling up. Sarah and Laura, exhausted, began restocking cups and cleaning the counters, trying to preserve what little dignity they had left. The glances they cast at Eric's empty office door said it all. They knew they wouldn't get help, no matter how overwhelmed they were. Michael's plan was to stay on the floor as long as possible, blending in, letting them assume he was just some hapless new hire. And as the day wore on, the antagonism only grew. For a moment, he wondered if he should break character just to provide relief to these people, to let them know someone was on their side. But he held off. He needed to see the full picture. He needed to find out just how toxic Eric was willing to get, how many people were protecting him, and whether Sarah or anyone else might be brave enough to speak up. Because it was in that speaking up that he could find the real heart of the problem and hopefully the path to the solution. He didn't have to wait long to uncover the hidden conflict that ran deeper than a single jerk of a shift supervisor. Toward the mid-afternoon lull, Sarah finally had a moment to breathe, so she went to check on the supply closet. Michael followed under the pretense of learning where things were stored, but really he wanted to talk to her away from Eric's scrutiny. She looked jittery, eyes flicking to the door every few seconds, as if Eric might barge in at any moment. When Michael quietly asked if everything was okay, she hesitated, then glanced down the hallway. "Look," she began in a hushed voice, "you seem nice, so I'll give you some advice. Just keep your head down. Don't make waves." She swallowed hard. "I tried that before, speaking up, and it cost me. Eric cut my hours from 35 a week to barely 20, just like that. I have a kid at home, so I can't afford to lose this job." Michael felt a twinge of guilt, knowing that he had the power to fix this, but also realizing Sarah had no idea who she was truly confiding in. He gently pressed for more details. "Is it just Eric?" he asked. "Or are there others who, back him up?" She nodded grimly. "He and the regional manager are old friends. And apparently the regional manager has a close relationship with the district head. It's like this chain of buddy-buddy nepotism. Anyone who complains either gets transferred to a worse location or they suddenly lose hours." She hesitated, eyeing the door again. "I mean, I don't even know if it's official or just an understanding, but enough people have tried to blow the whistle and ended up out of a job." Michael kept his expression neutral, but inside he was furious. This was precisely the sort of hidden network of favoritism and intimidation he'd suspected might be going on in some stores. The bigger grind-and-go coffee became, the more potential for corruption in the ranks. Hearing it from an employee's mouth confirmed his worst fears. At that moment, they heard Eric's voice echo down the hall. Sarah visibly flinched, her shoulders tensing. She hastily rearranged some coffee cups on a shelf and muttered, "Just stay on his good side. Trust me." With that, she hurried out, leaving Michael alone to seethe. A moment later, Eric passed by, phone still in hand, smirking at nothing in particular. Michael pretended to be busy counting stirrers until Eric was out of sight. Then, he sighed heavily, thinking about Sarah's predicament. He was about to leave the supply closet when a voice startled him. "Don't let him catch you back here. He'll say you're slacking," a low voice said from behind. It was a younger man in his early 20s, wearing a stained apron. His name tag read, Luis. Michael had seen Luis earlier, quietly washing dishes in the back. Luis's posture was timid, as if he expected to be scolded at any moment. Michael cleared his throat. "I'm just looking for the extra sugar packets," he lied. Luis half laughed, half sighed. "Right. Well, they're over there, top shelf," he said, then lowered his voice. "You new hires always come in thinking this might be a decent job. I give it a week before Eric has you doing extra tasks off." "The clock," Michael bristled. "Off the clock?" he repeated, feigning ignorance. "He can't do that." Luis shook his head. "He does it all the time. Tells us we gotta prep for the morning shift after we've already clocked out, or he'll mess with our schedules. Some people go along with it because they need the money, even though it's illegal. But what can we do? Corporate never listens." Michael forced himself not to reveal his emotions. This was bigger than Eric just being an obnoxious bully. He was apparently breaking labor laws, exploiting people who were desperate for a paycheck. The real question was how far up the chain this behavior was ignored or even encouraged. Luis picked up a box of lids and sighed again. "Keep your head down, man. This isn't a place that rewards good workers. It rewards favorites." Then he walked away, leaving Michael in the supply closet with a swirl of anger, disbelief, and a growing determination. Over the next few hours, small details began to surface that confirmed everything Sarah and Luis said. Michael watched as Eric forgot to clock out a younger male employee's break, effectively granting him more paid time. That same employee was apparently Eric's friend from outside work, so he got special treatment. Meanwhile, Sarah was berated for taking a bathroom break that ran too long, presumably because she was trying to call her babysitter back. The glaring inequities were right there in front of Michael's eyes, and it was gut-wrenching to think this had likely been going on for years, undetected by corporate management. The real kicker came in the form of a near accident. A customer spilled a large coffee on the floor, close to the prep area. Sarah asked for a mop multiple times, but there were none readily available. She begged Eric to open the locked storeroom for supplies, but Eric shrugged her off, claiming he was too busy with managerial duties. Sarah took some napkins to try to soak up the mess, and nearly slipped herself. A second later, a scalding pot of fresh coffee almost tipped over the edge of the counter, narrowly missing her leg. Had the coffee spilled on her, she could have been severely burned. And still, Eric barely glanced over to see if she was okay. That was the hidden conflict truly laid bare. Employees treated like disposable labor, while managers and their cronies floated by unscathed. It was more than a few rude remarks or incompetent leadership. This was a systematic abuse of power, protected by a network of favoritism that went up the chain. As the day approached closing time, Michael felt his resolve solidify. He couldn't leave these people at the mercy of Eric. Not only did they deserve better, but if Grind-and-Go Coffee continued to allow this kind of culture, the entire brand would be tarnished eventually. He vowed he would stand up for them, but the question was how and when. He considered revealing his identity now, but that might scare away potential witnesses or evidence. He decided it was better to wait until the right moment, especially a moment where Eric might incriminate himself openly, because the hidden conflict wasn't really hidden anymore. It was raging in plain sight, and the only thing missing was the final spark that would light the fuse. The next day, the situation escalated beyond what Michael had anticipated. He arrived early, deliberately showing up before Eric, hoping to catch any unfiltered conversations among employees setting up for the morning rush. The store was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering as they always did. A testament to the lack of care in this branch. Sarah was already there, yawning, stirring a large carafe of iced coffee, while Laura arranged the pastry display. Both women looked exhausted, as though they hadn't fully recovered from yesterday's onslaught. Michael offered a small wave, and Sarah managed a half smile. "You're early," she said softly. Trying to impress the boss, there was a note of sarcasm in her tone. Maybe even she had stopped believing that punctuality or hard work mattered. "Just wanted to make sure we have everything stocked," he said, scanning the shelves. Moments later, the door swung open with a clang, revealing Eric, who looked annoyed to even be there. He tossed his bag on a nearby table and grunted a greeting, then pulled out his phone as if on cue. Sarah, running on autopilot, passed him a list of things they were short on: milk, sugar packets, a particular brand of syrup. He glanced at it for half a second before shoving it into his back pocket without a word. Then he strolled to the back office, shutting the door behind him. Sarah's face fell. Laura rolled her eyes. "That's the third time this week," she muttered under her breath. "We're going to run out before the lunch rush." Michael saw a young male employee, Justin, wander in, still half asleep, and slump against the counter, waiting for his shift to officially start. Michael couldn't help noticing how Justin's tardiness or exhaustion was never addressed, while Sarah and Laura got reprimanded for even the smallest delay. As the morning rush began, customers poured in, seeking their caffeine fixes. Sarah worked the espresso machine like a marathon runner, not missing a beat. Laura balanced the register while also trying to package pastries. Michael jumped between tasks, doing his best to support them both. Meanwhile, Eric sat perched on a stool near the office, phone in hand, occasionally glancing up to bark an order if a line formed. And of course, everything went downhill when a large online order came through. It was a complicated set of drinks, pastries, and sandwiches, the sort of order that required careful coordination. Sarah tried to delegate tasks. Laura would handle pastries and rung up receipts. Michael would do all the hot drinks, and Sarah would tackle the iced beverages and finalize each bag. But Justin, apparently bored or perhaps irritated, complained that he'd have to clean the sandwich press afterward. "Why do I have to do it? It's not even my job," he whined. Michael was about to step in and say he would take care of it, but Sarah waved him off. She politely asked Justin to handle the sandwiches, reminding him that they worked as a team. That was when Eric decided to grace them with his presence. "What's all the commotion about?" he asked, mouth curling into a half sneer. Sarah tried to explain, but Eric cut her off. "Don't bark orders at Justin. If you want him to do something, you ask politely." The irony was painful. Eric, who belittled and berated employees constantly, was chiding Sarah for not being polite. Sarah, clearly flustered, apologized even though she had asked Justin quite civilly. Then she ran back to the machine to fix another round of iced lattes. It was only the beginning of a storm. Moments later, the online orders pickup window approached, and they were running behind schedule. Customers in line grew impatient. One older gentleman snapped at Laura. "I've been waiting 15 minutes for a simple coffee. Are you guys asleep back there?" Laura apologized profusely, while Eric merely glanced at his phone, unaffected. Sarah asked for help finishing the online order, but Eric wagged his finger at her. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he said, though he wasn't lifting a finger to contribute. That's when the real blow came. A major part of the online order was missing: several breakfast sandwiches. With the press cold, they were not even started. Sarah ran to the back to find Justin, who was supposed to prepare them, only to discover him scrolling on his phone. She pleaded with him to heat up the sandwiches immediately, explaining the customer was due any minute. Justin shrugged. "I ain't no miracle worker." Frustration peaked, and Sarah nearly lost it. "We're a team. Can you please just help out instead of—" She caught herself, noticing Eric emerging from the office. Eric slammed the door behind him, making everyone jump. He marched up to Sarah, jabbing a finger in her face. "Watch your tone. I run this store. If I say Justin doesn't have to do it, he doesn't. You got a problem with that?" He smiled, smugly, ignoring the fact that the entire store was in chaos. Sarah paled, her voice trembling. "But the order—" Eric cut her off again, speaking loud enough for customers to hear. "Get back to work, Sarah. Unless you don't want those 20 hours I gave you this week." The threat was blatant, and Sarah recoiled like she'd been slapped. Michael clenched his fists so tightly, his knuckles went white, but he had to maintain his composure. The tension rose another notch as the online order customer arrived, a frustrated woman tapping her foot at the counter. She asked for the manager, and Eric shot Michael a look. "Hey, new guy," he said with dripping condescension. "Go tell her we're delayed." "I don't have time for her complaining." Michael squared his shoulders. "Shouldn't you be the one talking to her if she wants a manager?" he asked, letting a trace of defiance creep into his voice. Eric sneered. "You questioning me? Just go deal with her." So Michael approached the customer, apologizing and explaining the delay. The woman was understandably upset, so Michael tried to remain courteous, offering her a free beverage voucher. But she demanded the manager, not some trainee. "I want to speak to someone who can actually fix this," she huffed. Michael looked to Eric, but he was busy fiddling with his phone again, ignoring the problem. Sarah stared at her shoes. Justin pretended not to notice, and Laura fought back tears from the stress of the rush. Finally, the sandwiches were hurriedly thrown into the oven, and the order was completed with a minimal apology from Eric himself. As soon as the customer left, Eric turned to Sarah, fixing her with a glare. "Next time, you handle it quicker," he growled. "We're not giving away free stuff on my watch." Michael couldn't believe the sheer nerve. Sarah was about to explain, but Eric dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Enough. You messed up. Don't argue." This entire exchange revealed just how imbalanced and unfair the store's dynamic was. Eric's favoritism toward Justin, his indifference to actual managerial responsibilities, and his brazen disrespect for customers and employees alike all wove together into a perfect storm of dysfunction. Michael felt his patience wearing thin. He'd seen enough, but he also sensed that something even bigger was going to happen soon. Eric was pushing everyone to the breaking point, and if Michael had learned anything from the day before, it was that once that line was crossed, either an employee would snap publicly or Eric would do something truly unforgivable. Either way, the tension was building, and there was no escaping the fact that this store was a powder keg. Michael secretly hoped someone might speak up before he had to reveal himself. It would make his confrontation all the more justified if others had the courage to stand against Eric's bullying. But so far, Sarah was too scared, Laura was too timid, and Justin was content to ride Eric's coattails. Luis was nowhere to be seen, likely forced into some menial task in the back, so there was no immediate ally for Michael to rally. Nonetheless, the seeds of rebellion were being planted. Every sneer from Eric, every shrugged-off request, every bully tactic pushed these workers one step closer to the edge, and Michael was determined to be there when it all went down, to make sure justice was finally served. The emotional tipping point arrived in the form of a single request from a customer that set off a chain reaction. It was midday, and the cafe was crowded again, lines forming out the door as people clamored for lunch and caffeine. Sarah, drenched in sweat, pressed the espresso machine buttons with mechanical efficiency, hustling to keep up. Laura and Michael alternated on register duty, trying to stay composed despite customers growing increasingly impatient. Justin was nowhere to be found, and Eric was glued to his phone as usual. Then a man in a suit approached the counter, clearly in a hurry, wanting a complicated custom latte. "Extra foam, 2 shots, caramel drizzle, double cupped," he rattled off. Laura nervously tried to ring it up, but the man corrected her 3 times on different customizations. Finally, he muttered under his breath about how incompetent everyone was. Sarah attempted to lighten the mood by joking with him, but he brushed her off. She kept working, pulling shots of espresso, steaming milk. Michael moved in to assist, handing her ingredients. She poured the beverage, topped it with foam, and carefully drizzled caramel. But as she turned to place the lid, a small miscalculation of her elbow led to a few droplets of caramel splashing onto the man's sleeve. He gasped, staring at the sticky dots on his crisp white shirt. Sarah immediately apologized, mortified, offering napkins and a free replacement. The man was furious, raising his voice. "You idiots can't do anything right, can you? Where's your manager?" he demanded, his tone echoing through the cafe. Sarah's cheeks flushed red as she tried to summon Eric, but Eric was in the corner, eyeing the whole situation with disinterest. Michael watched as Sarah took a deep breath and approached Eric. "He wants to talk to a manager." Please, can you? Eric shook his head, rolling his eyes. Handle it yourself, Sarah. You caused it. A flicker of panic crossed Sarah's face. She looked back at the man, who was now demanding some sort of compensation. Finally, Sarah tried to calm him down, explaining that it was a small accident, offering to pay for his dry cleaning out of her own pocket. She just wanted to de-escalate the situation. But the man grew louder, insulting Sarah personally, calling her clumsy, incompetent, and even accusing her of not being fit to hold a job. At that point, the entire cafe fell silent. A few customers whispered among themselves, while others watched the drama unfold like spectators at a sporting event. Laura stood frozen behind the register. Justin, who had just re-emerged from the back, stared wide-eyed. Michael clenched his fists, feeling a surge of protectiveness towards Sarah. She might have been at fault for the spill, but nobody deserved to be humiliated like that, especially when she tried to apologize. Sarah's voice trembled as she pleaded. I'm so sorry. I'll refund your drink. I'll even pay for the cleaning. Please just... But the man cut her off, his face contorting in rage. You worthless... he began, spitting out insults that made Sarah flinch as if physically struck. Then, out of nowhere, a single voice spoke up from the side. That's enough! Everyone turned to see Luis, usually silent and timid, stepping forward. He was carrying a mop, apparently in the middle of cleaning a spill. His eyes were fierce, a stark contrast to his usual meek demeanor. She said she's sorry. You have no right to speak to her like that, Luis said, his voice shaking yet determined. The furious customer eyed Luis up and down, sizing him up. Who are you? Another incompetent employee, he snapped. But Luis held his ground. I'm just someone who's tired of seeing good people treated like garbage, he shot back. A faint ripple of surprise went through the employees, including Michael, who silently cheered for Luis's courage. Sarah looked at him with gratitude, tears threatening to spill. You want a manager? There he is. Luis pointed at Eric. Talk to him instead of yelling at her. The man turned, glaring at Eric, who finally pocketed his phone and sauntered forward with a dismissive smirk. All right, calm down, Eric said to the outraged customer, but his tone lacked genuine concern. We'll give you a refund or something. No need to make a scene. The man gestured angrily at his shirt. A scene? Do you see what she did? Eric shrugged. Buy a new shirt and send the bill to our corporate, he said, then turned on Sarah. As for you, he snarled, I'm going to talk to you about this after your shift. The weight of his words hung in the air. Everyone knew that phrase usually meant losing hours, or worse. Michael watched Sarah's face blanch. The bullying from the customer was bad enough, but now Eric was about to punish her for a simple accident. Then something snapped inside Sarah. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe Luis's unexpected stand gave her courage. She lifted her head, tears glistening in her eyes, but anger burning behind them. What do you mean? Talk to me about this. You saw how he treated me, she said, nodding at the customer, who was now grabbing his latte and stalking away. He humiliated me. I apologized. I offered to make it right. Why are you blaming me? Eric narrowed his eyes. Because you embarrassed the store, he said coldly. The entire staff stiffened at the ridiculousness of the statement. It was obvious the store's biggest embarrassment was Eric himself, but he'd twisted the narrative to dump the blame on Sarah. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, then snapped. It shut, her shoulders trembling. Just then, a middle-aged woman at a nearby table stood up and said, Excuse me, I've been watching this whole thing. She did nothing wrong. You should be thanking her for handling that jerk of a customer so politely. Others in the cafe began to murmur in agreement. Eric's face tightened. It's none of your business, he growled at the woman, but the damage was done. He was losing control of the narrative in front of a store full of customers. Luis took advantage of the shift in atmosphere. See? People can tell who's at fault. You, Eric, you let that customer berate her. You've been bullying all of us for months. Eric shot him a look of pure venom. Watch your mouth, or you'll be gone by tomorrow. Luis stood firm, though he looked terrified. Maybe that's better than working under you. This was it, the emotional and narrative tipping point. The employees were starting to find their voices. Even the customers could sense the injustice, and Michael realized it was now or never. Either he would let this pass and watch Eric clamp down on them again, or he'd intervene. He stepped forward, trying to remain calm, though his heart pounded. Look, Eric, maybe we should all take a minute to cool off, he said in a steady voice. This is getting out of hand. Eric scowled. Don't tell me how to manage my store. Who do you think you are? Some big shot? Michael gave a vague shrug, keeping the tension alive. He wanted Eric to keep talking, to spill even more. And sure enough, Eric obliged. You worthless employees think you can just whine and cry, and someone will bail you out. Not here. This is my store. and my rules, and I can make your life miserable if I want. Sarah flinched, but Luis held his ground. Laura stood behind the register, her mouth half open, not sure what to say but clearly outraged. Michael looked at each of them, seeing their frustration and hurt. Then he glanced at the customers, some of whom stared wide-eyed at the commotion, others recording on their phones. The store buzzed with tension, like a coiled spring ready to snap, and from the determined set of Sarah's jaw, the glint of defiance in Luis's eyes, and the hush that fell over the crowd, Michael knew there was no turning back. Someone had to confront Eric openly, and it was going to happen right here, right now. That first confrontation hit like a slap in the face. Moments after Eric bragged about having total control, Michael found himself stepping forward, adrenaline pulsing. "Is this really how you think a manager should act?" he asked, voice resonating with barely contained anger. He couldn't hide his frustration any longer. These employees needed an ally. Eric sneered. "Do I need to remind you again who's in charge here?" he spat, stepping closer, squaring his shoulders in an attempt to intimidate Michael. "You're the new guy. If you don't like it, there's the door." Michael refused to back down. "Yeah, I'm new, but I know enough to see that the way you treat your employees is wrong. This place is supposed to have standards, ethical ones." Sarah and Luis exchanged glances. Maybe they were shocked that the mild-mannered new hire suddenly had a spine. Eric barked a humorless laugh. "Standards? You want to talk about standards while we're drowning in orders, incompetent staff, and customers who don't appreciate what we do?" He gestured around the messy store, ignoring the fact that the employees were busting their tails while he sat on his phone. "You think you can do better? Then go ahead." He stepped back, crossing his arms, challenging Michael to take command. Michael quietly glanced at Sarah, who looked like she wanted to intervene but was too scared. Then he turned to address the entire floor, speaking loudly enough for the lingering customers to hear. "I think we can do better if we stop belittling each other and start acting like a team." Eric scoffed. "Team? These people don't deserve that. They're incompetent. They can barely operate the machines." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed silent. Luis's jaw clenched. Laura looked like she might faint. A couple of customers shifted uncomfortably, wondering if they should leave or keep watching. Michael took a breath, steadying himself. He had to push Eric to reveal the full extent of his toxic behavior, right here in front of everyone, so there would be no backing down. "This is a cafe, not your personal kingdom," he said quietly, leveling his gaze at Eric. "You're supposed to lead by example, not rule by fear." Eric bristled, stepping forward again, invading Michael's personal space. He stood a few inches taller, trying to use his stature to intimidate. "Oh, you're a wise guy, huh?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can come in here brand new and tell me how to do my job?" Michael didn't budge. "Someone has to. No one else here dares speak up." At that, Eric let out a short, mocking laugh. "Because they know I can fire them, cut their hours, or just make their shifts a living hell. Maybe you should remember that before you open your mouth." There it was, Eric admitting, in front of staff and customers, that he used intimidation as a management tactic. Michael's blood boiled, but outwardly, he maintained an even composure. "So, you're proud of that?" he challenged. "Proud to watch your best workers suffer, living in fear?" Eric narrowed his eyes. "Watch your tone," he hissed. "You don't know who you're messing with." The standoff drew the attention of every person in the cafe. A hush fell, broken only by the steady hum of refrigerators and the hiss of the espresso machine. Sarah looked ready to cry, but a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. This was the first time anyone had gone toe-to-toe with Eric so directly. Even the customers seemed torn between ordering their next latte or watching the drama unfold. Suddenly, a middle-aged man in the corner who'd been quietly sipping his coffee piped up. "You shouldn't talk to your employees that way. They're working hard." Eric spun around, glaring at him. "Who asked you?" The man shrugged. I'm a paying customer, and you're creating a hostile environment. Maybe I should take my business elsewhere. Eric's face reddened. Go ahead, he muttered, turning back toward Michael. We don't need customers like that. At this point, Michael was nearly shaking with anger at how brazen Eric was being. Still, he said calmly, you're driving customers away. You're harassing employees. You're ignoring basic safety and quality standards. Don't you see a problem here? The only problem is you, Eric snapped. He turned to Sarah. And you, and everyone else who thinks they can mouth off to me. He glanced at Luis next, who recoiled slightly but kept his chin high. I'm done playing nice, Eric growled. Anyone who doesn't follow my orders to the letter is out. Customers gasped. Some actually began filming on their phones, capturing Eric's meltdown. Sarah closed her eyes, preparing for the worst. Luis stepped closer to her, as if forming a united front. Laura bit her lip, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Michael saw his moment to press further. You really believe you can run this place without these people? They're your backbone. They're the reason the customers come back. Eric snorted. I can hire new staff whenever I want. People are desperate for jobs. That was the final straw. Michael could sense that every employee in earshot was near a breaking point. They'd held in their frustration for so long, and now all of it was boiling over in front of customers and coworkers alike. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but her voice broke. Luis gently patted her back. Even Justin, who'd been Eric's favorite, looked troubled. He stood by the pastry case, eyes darting nervously. Maybe he was realizing that Eric's brand of management could turn on him just as easily. The tension hung like a thick fog, suffocating the room. Michael knew that if he held back any longer, Sarah and Luis might suffer more retribution before he could stop it. So he raised his voice, just enough to be heard by everyone. You don't deserve these people, he said, his words echoing. They deserve a real manager who cares about them and the customers, not a self-absorbed bully. Eric let out a primal scoff, practically spitting. Big talk from a rookie. Let's see if you're still singing that tune when you're unemployed. Michael stepped forward, unafraid. I'm not worried, he said. Maybe you should be. And with that, the tension reached a fever pitch. Eric looked like he was about to lunge. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Luis tensed, ready to intervene. Customers whispered, some openly filming, while others clutched their cups in wide-eyed astonishment. In that moment, a line had been drawn. The entire store seemed to sense that something transformative was happening. The old pattern of Eric's dominance was being challenged publicly, and there was no way to sweep it under the rug now. For the first time, Eric realized he might not be the scariest person in the room. His eyes flickered with uncertainty. Just for a second, he was about to discover that you can only push people so far before they push back harder. The pushback came faster and harder than Eric could have anticipated. Right after Michael's confrontation, Sarah found her voice in a sudden burst of courage. Eric, you have no right to treat us like this, she said, her hands trembling but her eyes resolute. She nodded toward the stunned crowd of customers. Everyone can see how unfair you are. We don't deserve this abuse. Eric wheeled on her, anger blazing in his eyes. What did you say? He demanded, stepping closer, practically towering over her. Sarah stood her ground. I said we don't deserve this, she repeated, louder this time. Her fear was evident, but so was her determination. Luis stepped up beside her, voice shaking, but steadfast. She's right. We've been busting our tails, covering for your laziness. You sit on your phone all day, and then you threaten us. Enough is enough. Eric let out a dry, humorless chuckle, glancing around as if searching for an ally. Justin crossed his arms, hesitant, but didn't step forward to defend him. Laura gripped the edges of the register, her knuckles white, as though she was barely holding herself together. The customers, emboldened by the employees' show of unity, began to voice their support. A couple declared they would report Eric to corporate. Another remarked that no one should have to work under such hostile conditions. So, you're all just going to turn against me? Eric snarled, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. You think corporate's going to swoop in and save you? Newsflash, I'm tight with the regional manager. You people are nothing to them, just warm bodies behind a counter. The store fell silent momentarily. Shocked by his brazen confession, Michael knew that was exactly the kind of evidence he needed, a verbal admission of the nepotism that allowed him to keep power. He could practically see the phone cameras capturing every second, and he silently thanked fate for delivering such perfect proof. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, Sarah pulled off her apron and threw it on the counter. She'd reached a breaking point. "I don't care who you know," she whispered, her voice quivering with defiance. "I can't take this anymore. My kid needs a mum who isn't crying herself to sleep every night." She turned to her coworkers. "I'm done. I quit." Luis's eyes widened, and for a second, he looked torn. But then he stepped forward, removing his own apron. "Me too," he said in a quiet but firm voice. "I can't live in fear that my hours will be cut if I don't grovel at your feet." The scene was electrifying. Two of the store's best workers, arguably the two who did the most to keep things afloat, had openly rebelled. Eric's arrogance wavered as he realized the store was suddenly short-staffed. "Fine," he snapped, trying to regain control. "I'll just replace you with people who actually want to work. Get out!" He acted as though he was doing them a favor by letting them leave. The moment Sarah and Luis stepped away, though, the dynamic shifted. The line of customers grew restless, some leaving in protest, others filming, and a select few calling out that Eric was the one who needed to go. Over by the register, Laura trembled. She looked at Sarah and Luis, then at Eric. After a tense pause, she too pulled her apron off. "I can't do this alone," she said softly. "I have anxiety attacks every morning before work, wondering if today will be the day I get fired for something stupid. It's not worth it." She placed her apron gently on the counter, tears shimmering in her eyes, then joined Sarah and Luis. For a moment, Justin stood frozen, caught between loyalty to Eric's favoritism and a sense of moral alignment with his co-workers. He hovered near the pastry case, jaw clenched, clearly torn. But in the end, he didn't remove his apron. He stayed silent, stepping back as if to distance himself from the confrontation. That left only Michael and Eric behind the counter, with a crowd of customers who were either outraged or enthralled. Eric locked eyes with Michael, an unspoken challenge surging between them. "Is this what you wanted?" Eric snarled, gesturing to the newly formed line of apronless employees. "A walkout? Congratulations, hero. Now we have no one to run this place." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah got there first. "We might not have jobs," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "but at least we have our dignity." She turned, taking the others by the arm, and started for the door. A few customers actually applauded them as they left. Others snapped photos, clearly planning to share this shocking meltdown. Eric's face twisted in rage as he watched his workforce evaporate. "You're all making a huge mistake," he hollered after them, though it rang hollow. He spun toward Michael. "This is your fault. You, stirring them up with your talk of ethics." Michael's heart pounded as he debated whether to reveal himself now or wait. Part of him wanted to rip off his disguise and show Eric exactly who he'd been messing with. Another part wanted Eric to push a little further, dig himself into an even deeper hole. The tension crackled in the air, heavy and electric. "They deserve better," Michael said, refusing to back down. "Whether that means working here under good management or finding another job where they're respected." Eric advanced on him, voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You think you're some kind of savior? I can destroy you. I'll make sure no one hires you after I'm done. You'll be blacklisted in this whole district." Michael almost laughed at the threat, but he maintained his composure. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, delivering the line with calm finality. Eric's eyes flashed. "Enough of this. You're done. You hear me? Finished. Get out of my store before I have security escort you out." Michael crossed his arms, standing his ground. "No, I'm not leaving until we settle this." Eric barked a laugh. "Oh, you want a severance package? You want me to sign some reference letter? Get lost. You're lucky I don't call the cops." A single beep from a customer's phone cut through the standoff. Several onlookers were filming, and the tension was palpable. Eric's hand was shaking slightly, but he tried to mask it with bravado. "Fine, stand there if you want," he said, turning to address the remaining customers. "Can I help anyone?" But many customers had already left, or were waiting to see the spectacle end. The mood was sour, the store in disarray. Eric was left with a battered sense of control, and all around him were witnesses to his meltdown. For a split second, he glanced around, as if realizing there was no way to salvage his reputation. Michael could see the wheels turning in Eric's head, searching for a way out. But the employees had pushed back, and the customers had witnessed every ugly word. The tables had turned, and Michael stood at the epicenter of this raging storm. Eric's veneer of authority was crumbling, and what remained was a cornered bully, desperate to reassert dominance. Michael took a slow, deep breath. The pushback had begun, but the real showdown was yet to come. He could feel it building, a tidal wave of truth ready to crash down on Eric once and for all. That climactic confrontation arrived when Eric, reeling from the loss of most of his staff, realized just how precarious his situation had become. The cafe was nearly empty now. Customers had either witnessed enough drama or simply given up on getting served. The few who remained had their phones out, capturing every second as Eric prowled around the counter, glaring at Michael, who stood calmly, arms folded. The tension soared when one final group of customers entered, a small cluster of businessmen. On their lunch break, clearly in a hurry, they took a look at the shattered workforce, just Michael and Eric behind the counter, and frowned. Eric, desperate to appear in control, slung on a fake smile and greeted them in a strained voice. "Welcome to Grind and Go Coffee," he said with forced cheeriness. "What can I get for you?" The men placed their order, and Eric gestured for Michael to handle the register. Michael silently moved to ring them up, not out of obedience, but simply to observe how Eric would handle an actual rush without any staff. Sure enough, Eric fumbled, dropping cups, messing up the coffee machine's settings, cursing under his breath every few seconds. Occasionally, he'd snap at Michael, telling him to speed up or that he was doing it wrong. But Michael just ignored the barbs. The final straw came when the men grew impatient, one of them checking his watch repeatedly. "Look, we're late for a meeting," he said. "We need our drinks, or we're out of here." Eric tried to hurry, only to burn himself on the steam. "Wand," he hissed in pain, dropping the frothing pitcher on the floor with a loud clang. Hot milk splattered everywhere, narrowly missing Michael. Eric cursed loudly in front of the customers, who looked scandalized. One of them shook his head, in disbelief, and turned to leave. That's when Eric lost what little composure he had left. "Stop!" he yelled, sounding borderline unhinged. "We'll finish your drinks. Just wait." But the men were already halfway out the door, having decided no coffee was worth this fiasco. Eric whirled on Michael, pointing an accusing finger. "This is your fault," he thundered. "If you and those other losers hadn't caused a scene, we wouldn't be in this mess." Michael gave a slow shake of his head. "You chased them away all by yourself," he said quietly. "The employees, the customers, it's all on you." Eric slammed the empty pitcher down on the counter. "That's it. I've had enough." He stalked up to Michael, so close their noses almost touched. "You want to act like you own the place? Fine, let's see how brave you are when I drag you out of here." The air thickened as Eric reached for Michael's shirt, presumably to manhandle him out the door. But Michael sidestepped quickly, his voice steady. "Touch me, and you'll regret it." The intensity of his stare caught Eric off guard. "Oh yeah?" Eric challenged, though there was a waver in his voice. "Who's gonna stop me?" Michael hesitated for the briefest moment, then decided the time had come. He took a step back, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small ID badge, flipping it open for Eric to see. The entire cafe, customers, the few employees who hadn't yet walked out, even random onlookers, seemed to hold their breath. "My name isn't Mike Rogers," Michael said clearly. "I'm Michael Reynolds, CEO of Grind and Go Coffee, and you've been digging your own grave since the moment I walked in." The silence was absolute. Eric's eyes darted to the ID badge, which clearly displayed Michael's photo and title. His jaw dropped open, and for once he had nothing to say. One of the customers let out a gasp, and another actually laughed in disbelief. Slowly, Eric's expression morphed from shock to disbelief, then to a kind of panic. "That's not possible," he sputtered. "This is a joke. You're lying." Michael gave him a level stare. "I assure you, I'm not lying. You want to call corporate and verify. Go ahead." He nodded toward the store phone. "In fact, I encourage it." Eric's skin went pale. He took a stumbling step backward, knocking into the counter. But the regional manager," he stammered. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Yes, let's talk about that. You said you're buddies with the regional manager, that you have some special immunity. I'd love to hear the details." Eric opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Meanwhile, the few remaining customers were either filming or whispering, eyes wide at this dramatic twist. Michael saw Sarah, Luis and Laura peeking through the front windows, having stopped on the sidewalk. They caught sight of the reveal, stepping back inside, looking stunned, but hopeful. Eric scanned the faces around him, realizing all eyes were on him. He tried to muster bravado, but it came out shaky. You can't just fire me," he said, grasping at straws. "I have a contract, and I've done nothing wrong." Michael took a slow breath, reining in his anger. Done plenty wrong, he said, voice still measured. I have you on record verbally abusing staff, threatening to cut hours if they speak up, ignoring safety hazards, and driving away customers, not to mention all these people have witnessed it. He gestured around the cafe, where phones were still pointed at Eric. Eric's face flushed deep red. That's all hearsay. You have no proof. A middle-aged woman in the corner raised her phone. I have proof, she said softly. I've been recording everything since that poor woman had caramel splashed on that rude customer. Sarah stepped forward, tears in her eyes, but this time they looked like tears of relief. He's telling the truth, she said, nodding toward Michael. Eric has bullied us for months, Louise chimed in. He made us do tasks off the clock. That's illegal. Eric swiveled his head, looking for any kind of lifeline, but none was forthcoming. Customers, employees, even random bystanders, all stared at him with judgmental eyes. Slowly, the arrogance leaked out of him, replaced by desperation. Wait, he babbled, turning to Michael. Look, I can explain. I was under a lot of stress, okay? The store's performance has been slipping. Corporate's on my back. Michael held up a hand, cutting him off. You're responsible for the store's performance. You chose to bully your staff instead of leading them. You've done nothing but confirm every complaint we've had about this branch. Eric tried to stand taller, though it was clear he was on shaky ground. So what? You're just going to humiliate me in front of everyone, he demanded, voice quivering. Michael's gaze hardened. You humiliated yourself. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft hum of the store's refrigeration units. Sarah, Louise, and Laura stood together, united in their relief. Michael glanced their way, giving them a nod of reassurance. Then he turned back to Eric, delivering the final blow. You're done here, he stated, voice echoing with authority. Effective immediately, Eric opened his mouth in protest, but no words formed. He looked around at the cameras, the employees, the customers, and seemed to realize he had no safe exit. At last, he mumbled something incoherent, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Then, with trembling hands, he tore off his manager's badge and slammed it on the counter. Fine, I quit, he spat, trying to regain some sense of control. He looked at Sarah and Louise one last time, as if this were their fault, then stormed out of the store, leaving behind a stunned audience. As the door shut behind him, a palpable wave of relief washed over the cafe. Some customers clapped, others let out sighs of astonishment. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears finally rolling down her cheeks. Louise placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, and Laura looked on, overwhelmed. Michael exhaled, adrenaline still surging. He allowed himself a moment to absorb the surreal scene. Employees he'd come to care about standing there, free from the oppressive presence of Eric at last. The climactic confrontation was over, but its impact would resonate far beyond this single store. In the immediate aftermath, the tension that had suffocated the cafe lifted like a heavy curtain being pulled aside to let in sunlight. A few customers even cheered, whistling in support, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief that they had witnessed such a spectacle. Michael stood there, feeling the adrenaline drain out of him, leaving a sense of calm determination in its wake. The employees, what remained of them, slowly gathered around him, eyes wide, uncertain how to proceed now that the store's tyrant was gone. Sarah wiped her tears, and then, in a hesitant voice, she said, So, you're really the CEO? Michael nodded, offering a gentle smile. Yes, I started Grind and Go Coffee a few years back. I've been going undercover to see what's really happening at our stores. Louise let out a shocked laugh, looking at the spot where Eric's name tag lay abandoned. I can't believe it. All this time you were... He trailed off, trying to wrap his mind around the revelation. Laura, eyes still wet, asked the question on everyone's mind. What happens now? Michael took a deep breath, turning to face the dozen or so remaining customers who had stayed behind, some still filming. We're going to close down for the rest of the day, on the house, if you'd like to take any pastries or coffee with you. We need some time to get this store in order. But I promise you, when we reopen, things will be different. A murmur of appreciation and curiosity rippled through the customers. Some started gathering their things, while others approached the counter to thank Sarah and the others for standing up to Eric. One man gave Sarah a sympathetic pat on the arm, telling her she deserved better. Another offered to email corporate, praising the employees who had stood up for themselves. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Sarah sniffled, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she managed, voice quivering. Then, as the last customers trickled out, Michael locked the door, placing a hastily printed sign on the entrance that read, "Temporarily closed for maintenance." Through the glass, a few curious onlookers peered in, but for the most part, the drama seemed to have dispersed. Inside, Michael faced the employees. Even Justin stood around, hands shoved in his pockets, looking awkward and uncertain, as if he didn't know whether he was still welcome. Sarah cleared her throat. "I'm sorry I quit earlier," she said quietly. "I just couldn't take it anymore. I need this job, but I also couldn't keep dealing with Eric." Michael stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No apology needed. You did what you had to do to protect yourself. I'm the one who's sorry for letting things get this bad in the first place." Luis couldn't contain his surprise. "You mean you actually care about what happens to us?" Michael's features softened. "Of course I do. I started this company because I wanted to create a place people would love, customers and employees alike. Somewhere along the line, things went wrong at this store, and I take responsibility for that. But now I'm here to fix it." Sarah and Luis exchanged hopeful glances. Laura piped up. "So, does that mean we still have our jobs? Or do you have to officially rehire us?" She gestured to the apron she'd thrown off earlier, which lay on a table. Michael exhaled, a slight smile forming. "If you want your jobs, they're yours. I'll be bringing in some temporary help from other locations to make sure we can reopen properly. But I'd very much like you to stay, if that's what you want." Tears of relief welled up in Laura's eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered, picking up her apron. "I don't even know what to say." Luis nodded fervently, picking up his own apron. "I'm in." Then they both looked expectantly at Sarah, who was still trembling. "If you'll still have me," she said hesitantly. "I'd love to keep working here. I can't lie. I almost walked out for good, but I need this job, and maybe now it'll be better." Michael smiled. "I want to make sure it is. For all of you." He glanced at Justin, who stood off to the side, head lowered in shame. Sensing the moment, Justin approached cautiously. I know I took advantage of Eric's favoritism," he admitted, voice hushed. "I didn't realize how bad it was for the rest of you. Or maybe I didn't want to realize it. If there's any chance I can stay, I promise I'll do better." Michael studied him for a moment, recalling how Justin had shrugged off tasks and let Eric handle everything, but he also saw the regret in the young man's eyes. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Michael said quietly, "but you have to earn it. I expect you to pull your weight, support your co-workers, and respect them." Justin nodded eagerly. "I will, thank you." The employees exchanged relieved smiles. Sarah tentatively reached out and patted Justin on the back, a small gesture of acceptance. Meanwhile, outside, a short line of curious people had formed, wondering why the store was closed in the middle of the day. Michael glanced at them, then turned back to the staff. "We'll reopen tomorrow," he said. "And when we do, we'll have a new approach, one that values everyone and makes sure no one is mistreated. For now, let's clean up, take inventory, and make sure this store is up to standard. We'll meet after that to talk about how we're going to move forward." A wave of cautious optimism rippled through the group. They set about tidying the store, wiping counters, discarding old pastries, reorganizing the supply room. Even though they were exhausted, the atmosphere felt lighter, buoyed by a newfound sense of possibility. While they worked, Michael quietly called the corporate office, instructing them to send an interim manager to help oversee operations. He also requested a thorough audit of this store's time cards and schedules, determined to rectify any wage theft or hour manipulations Eric had inflicted. After the cleaning, they gathered around a table, sipping water and munching on leftover pastries. Sarah massaged her temples, tension releasing from her body. Laura leaned back in her chair, a slight smile on her lips. Luis stared at the floor, absorbing the day's events. Justin sat on the edge of a stool, fiddling with his apron strings, clearly trying to figure out how best to reintegrate himself into a team he'd once neglected. Michael looked at each of them, feeling an immense responsibility. He knew this was just one store, one instance of wrongdoing, but it represented a bigger problem that might lurk in other locations. Still, in this immediate aftermath, he also felt a surge of hope. Here were employees who, given the chance, might thrive under proper leadership. "We're a family," he finally said, his tone sincere. "That's how I always envisioned Grind and Go Coffee. A big family of employees and customers who enjoy good coffee and respect each other. If any of you ever see someone like Eric again, I want you to come directly to me or to the corporate hotline. No more suffering in silence." "Agreed." They nodded, some more fervently than others. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said again. "I don't think any of us expected this. Finding out our new hire was actually the CEO. Luis allowed himself a wry grin. "Yeah, talk." About a twist, a ripple of laughter passed among them, lightening the solemn mood. Though the store remained closed for the day, an air of promise filled the space, like a brand new chapter was starting. The immediate aftermath might have been chaotic and emotional, but it signaled a brighter future for everyone who had endured Eric's tyranny. As they wrapped up, Michael felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The day had been draining, but at least now, this location was free from the venomous grip of a manager who had no respect for human dignity. In that sense, the day was a victory, not just for Michael, but for Sarah, Luis, Laura, Justin, and every employee who had ever suffered in silence. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, the final wrap-up of the day's events began to settle in. Michael found himself standing outside the store, gazing through the window at the reflection of the staff, his staff, laughing quietly as they shared a moment of camaraderie, free from Eric's oppression. It felt surreal to see them relaxed, as though the tension that had been strangling them for months finally snapped. He turned away from the window and exhaled, relishing the mild evening air. For the first time, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones, but also a deep satisfaction that his undercover mission had achieved something tangible. He heard the door open behind him, and Sarah stepped out, hugging herself against the breeze. "We're just about done cleaning up," she said softly. "I think it'll be good to go tomorrow." Michael nodded. "Thank you for staying, for trusting me." She gave a small laugh, looking at her feet. "It's funny, just yesterday I was ready to give up on this place. Now, I actually want to come back." The sincerity in her voice warmed Michael's heart. He remembered why he founded Grind and Go Coffee in the first place, to create a welcoming community, to bring people together over something as simple as a cup of coffee. Yet somewhere along the way, people like Eric had slipped through the cracks. Sarah glanced at the sky. "I should get home to my kid," she murmured. "I had to call in a favor from a neighbor today because my babysitter had an emergency. But now that Eric's gone, I'm not worried about being penalized for leaving on time." She paused, chewing her lip. "Thank you for that." Michael shook his head gently. "You don't have to thank me. That's how it always should have been." She nodded, tears glistening. "Yeah, I guess so." She stepped back inside briefly to gather her purse, emerging a moment later. They exchanged a warm smile before she headed off into the dusk, relief evident in her posture. As Michael lingered by the door, Luis and Laura approached. Having finished sweeping up, they offered him a friendly nod, clearly still in awe of his true identity. Laura cleared her throat. "I guess I'll see you tomorrow, boss." Her use of boss held no sarcasm this time. It was filled with gratitude. Michael managed a chuckle. "Yeah, I'll be here, bright and early. We have a lot of changes to make." Luis clapped Michael on the shoulder. "Thanks for standing up for us. Feels like I can actually breathe for the first time in months." With that, they headed out, leaving only Justin inside. Michael went back in to find Justin wiping the counters, shoulders tense. When Justin noticed Michael, he froze, rag in hand. "You need something, sir?" he asked, voice subdued. Michael recognized this was the moment to address any lingering issues. "No, nothing specific," he said, pulling out a stool and taking a seat. "Just wanted to check on you. I know you got caught up in Eric's favoritism. That's not entirely your fault. He exploited a situation." Justin swallowed, nodding. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry if I ever made things harder for Sarah or the others." Eric liked me because I reminded him of someone, I guess, and it was easier to stay on his good side. Michael offered a wry smile. I get it, survival. But now you see there's a better way, right? Justin exhaled, setting the rag aside. Yes, I do. I want to do better. For myself. And for everyone else. I don't want to be that guy who takes advantage of others. It's not who I am. Not really. Michael stood up, resting a hand on Justin's shoulder. I believe you. Let's make tomorrow the start of something good. Okay? Justin's eyes shone with determination. I'll be here. Michael nodded, stepping aside to let Justin pass. The young man flipped the sign from temporarily closed to closed, then locked the door. They flicked off the lights, leaving the store bathed in the muted glow of street lamps. Outside, the air felt cooler, the city's sounds blending into the background. As they parted ways, Michael glanced back at the darkened storefront. A swirl of emotions coursed through him. Relief, pride, shame that the situation had gone unchecked for so long, and hope for what the future could hold. The next day came quickly, and Michael arrived before dawn. The interim manager, a veteran of the company who had run other branches successfully, met him there. They shook hands, exchanging a knowing look. The manager had read the emergency report Michael filed, detailing Eric's behavior, the staff walkout, and the plan for immediate improvements. By opening time, Sarah, Luis, and Laura were there, looking refreshed if still a bit anxious. Justin arrived too, earlier than usual, determined to prove himself. A small crowd of curious regulars had gathered, whispering among themselves. They'd heard rumors that something drastic had happened the day before, though not all knew the full story yet. Once the doors opened, the atmosphere was distinctly different, lighter, more welcoming. Michael stayed at the sidelines, letting the interim manager guide the staff, offering training and moral support. Customers trickled in, some tentatively asking if things were okay. Sarah greeted each of them with a genuine smile, no longer overshadowed by dread. Laura handled the register with a newfound confidence, and Luis took charge of restocking supplies, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Even Justin pitched in without complaint, learning to craft beverages with care. In short, the store underwent a small renaissance. Word spread quickly that a big change had occurred. By noon, they were busier than ever, but instead of chaos, there was an energized harmony. Customers noticed the shift, complimenting the staff on their service, praising the improved cleanliness, and expressing relief that the toxic energy was gone. Michael stepped forward at one point to speak briefly with a group of regulars who recognized him as the undercover new hire. He flashed them a sheepish grin, and they laughed, joking about how they never suspected he was the CEO. The relief in their laughter spoke volumes, as did the employees' improved morale. Near the end of that day, the interim manager gathered everyone for a quick meeting in the now spotless dining area. Michael joined them, arms folded across his chest, a proud smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The manager commended their efforts, praised their teamwork, and assured them that corporate would be supporting this store's transition back to a place of respect and efficiency. Sarah spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. I know this. It's just the beginning, but I already feel like we're moving in the right direction. Thank you for giving us another chance. The manager nodded and then looked to Michael, expecting him to say something. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I just want you all to know that none of you should ever have to deal with abuse like that again, he said. We're implementing new checks and balances, and I'm personally going to make sure that no manager can ever wield that kind of power unchecked. He paused, looking at Sarah, then Luis, then Laura and Justin. You deserve a safe, fair workplace, and we're going to give it to you. A wave of gentle applause came from the staff. In that moment, the store felt more like a family than it ever had under Eric's tyranny. The final emotional gut punch, or perhaps the final sigh of relief, came when Eric tried to call Michael's phone later that evening. The call went unanswered, and Michael blocked the number. He had no interest in hearing the man's excuses or pleas. The decision was final, the damage done, and the store was already healing from his departure. By the end of the second day, as Michael prepared to move on to another location in need of similar scrutiny, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He'd seen firsthand the damage one toxic manager could inflict, how it could corrode an entire work environment and terrorize decent people. But he'd also witnessed the strength of those same people when given the chance to stand up for themselves. Before leaving, he took one last walk through the store, inhaling the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, listening to the hum of contented chatter between employees and customers. Sarah caught his eye, smiling warmly, and he returned the gesture. It was a silent understanding that they had all come through fire together, and now things could only get better. As he stepped outside into the brisk evening air, Michael couldn't help but reflect on one central truth. A company is only as good as the people who run it. And today, they had taken a giant leap toward ensuring that Grind and Go Coffee lived up to its promise, not through slick marketing or empty slogans, but through genuine respect and a culture that valued every individual. With a final glance at the glowing sign above the door, Michael left, feeling an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. No corporate restructuring plan could match the emotional impact of seeing real people reclaimed from the clutches of a bully. It was the kind of change that reminded him why he'd started Grind and Go Coffee in the first place. And as he walked away, the neon lights fading behind him, he knew that for these employees, and soon, employees in every store, things would never be the same again.